Thank you very much, Richard. And good afternoon to all of you. You'll be relieved to know from the schedule that my talk is fairly brief. You may or may not be relieved to know that I don't have any slides, so you may have to stay awake if you want to actually hear what I have to say. I suspect I may have been invited here because Disc Holdings is one of what are still relatively few examples of real live operational blockchain technology in the real world, and we believe in our own way that we are doing good. But as Richard has alluded, and I think we need to be clear about this, my domain expertise is finance, and the problems and operations that we're addressing are being addressed in the UK, at least for now, and our development work is taking place in the UK and Europe. So I'm still with the mainstream, and the problems I'm dealing with are what many people would describe as first world problems. I make no particular apology for either of those things. I believe firmly, and we have held this belief since we started Disc Holdings, which for those of you that don't know was previously called GovCoin. We changed the name for a variety of reasons, which I also won't go into. But if you're dealing with something that is as reputationally stigmatized as Bitcoin and blockchain has been for many years and is well outside of the mainstream, you should really be conducting whatever business you want to conduct in an environment where people can take some comfort that the regulators are mature, sensible and organized, and that the government is interested and engaged and has relatively high standards. And therefore, to start something in the UK is, in our view, entirely obvious, not least assisted by the fact that London remains a key global centre for the development of financial technology, whether blockchain related or otherwise. The second thing that I would say is that the issues that we have faced and continue to face as we develop our business are applicable whether you're dealing with first world problems or third world problems, whether you're dealing with financial problems or other problems. It is not coincidental that a business described as distributed ledger technology is about ledgers, and it's not a surprise that financial institutions whose entire business is simply about ledgers should be the focal point of development in that arena. And indeed, shared ledgers are not new to the financial industry. Cryptography is not new to the financial industry. The techniques of distributed ledger technology are actually not new to the financial industry. But the application of them to interesting problems is something that they haven't really bothered with before. But the issues that we have to address are: what is the role of blockchain in what we're doing? How can and should people engage to deliver better results for their, I'll call them constituents, you can call them clients, customers, however you want to describe them, whoever and wherever they are? What are the challenges of the technology itself, and in particular its application at scale, and how do you get it paid for? All of those things are relevant whether you're doing good or wherever you are doing good. Now, the good that we are seeking to achieve and stimulate is the good that's known as financial inclusion. And I want to briefly define that because everybody has a point of view about financial inclusion. So throughout most of history, people transferred value by initially pieces of gold, pieces of silver, things that had value, more recently by pieces of paper, which by virtue of their government and central bank backing are deemed to have value. When people lose faith in this, they revert back to cigarettes or whatever other common useful currency might be. The beauty of this is it's instantaneous and anonymous. If I give it to Richard, he's got it. He and I have agreed that it's worth something. And the Bank of England is willing to confirm that it's worth something. The beauty of this is actually when everybody was using these, everybody was financially included. Financial exclusion was not a problem when people dealt in cash and coin. But there are obviously a lot of risks with it. Physical security being but the most obvious, fraud and forgery being others, and the lack of any meaningful record of transactions ever having taken place being another. So we moved on about 50 years ago to what we now refer to as payments 2.0. So cash is payment 1.0, this is payment 2.0. So this now creates an electronic record on a ledger. This is the way that most of the value in the developed world is now passed from one party to another. And over 50 years, this looks very similar to the card that any of us could have got 50 years ago. The technology has not materially changed over 50 years. The beauty of this is that it does create a digital record. It doesn't have any value in and of itself, and therefore the ledgers that the parties engaged in the transactions associated with this card, those ledgers become the value. Those ledgers are typically held by banks. And in banks, for a long time, we trusted. We may or may not trust them quite as much as we did 10 years ago, but we still, even if we don't trust them, we recognize that we rely on them to hold records. But when you rely on them to hold records and you allow people to start moving money about, whether they're using a phone or a card or a contactless card, whatever it is, you then have another series of risks. The series of risks are mainly, again, around fraud. Equally, they're around identity. People need to know who I am. If I'm going to instruct NatWest to pay money out of my account, NatWest had better be pretty damn sure that they know who I am. And it would be helpful, as far as governments are concerned at least, if they were pretty sure who I was paying money to. So we've now moved on. For the last 50 years, we've been in payments. So we had thousands of years of just moving money about in terms of pieces of paper and notes and coins. We've had 50 years of pieces of plastic and digital records, which is not coincidentally about as long as banks have actually been using computers to do anything useful. And indeed, many of the banks are still using the computers that they were using 50 years ago and the systems they developed 50 years ago to conduct these transactions. We have built a fantastically complex and brilliantly at one level sophisticated and resilient global network that enables any of us in this room to go almost anywhere in the world and go and pay for a hotel room, a car hire, and even a newspaper. The only problem with that approach, which is very beneficial for us in this room, is that it is fantastically expensive. Fantastically expensive. All of the checks and balances, do I have enough money in my account to make this payment? All of that processing is very expensive, and if you don't conduct those checks, you are open to risk of real loss. And risk of real loss occurs all of the time. If you want to wonder why your contactless card can only be used for transactions up to £30, it's very simple. It's like giving somebody access to your bank account, albeit £30 at a time. But the risk of loss is real. It's continually, work is done to improve things, but it's expensive. It is also the case that the allocation of cost is regressive. So the people who are vulnerable to overspending actually face the highest charges. So if I make a series of payments on this, and I get a statement in a month's time, and it says I owe £1,000, and I say, oh dear, I don't have £1,000, I've only got £100. The people running this card say, well, that's not a problem. We'll extend you £900 worth of credit. And actually, because you're a good guy and we've known you a while, we'll only charge you 1.5% a month for that, which is about 20% a year. If I had an in-store credit card, that would be 30% a year. If not 40%, would be 3% a month. So those people who aren't necessarily as sophisticated as I am financially, who don't necessarily tot up every time they use a credit card how much they can spend, once a month get a statement, and if they can't pay it off, someone's willing to lend them money at what, by most standards, would be regarded as a usurious rate of interest. If, on the other hand, I use a debit card, then, in theory, that gets honoured. Now I go overdrawn because I'm not controlling my finances. If I go overdrawn, the bank's happy for me to go overdrawn because it charges me £25 for an unauthorised overdraft fee and about 5% over base rate as a privilege for borrowing money from them. Not only is it individuals that this is regressive for, if you talk to a newsagent in Hyde, Greater Manchester, as we do, you will find that they are paying between 2 and 5% to a merchant acquirer for the privilege of accepting a card. Now, I happen to travel to Greater Manchester in Hyde because that's where we're conducting the mainstream of our business, but the fact is most of you won't. And the fact is most of the people who benefit from the existing card system will not necessarily be doing much business with that newsagent in Hyde, or indeed with Pete's Chippy, or any one of dozens of other local retailers who are devastatingly used by the system. So our convenience, our global convenience that enables us to do all sorts of nice and interesting things, is being paid for by a bunch of people who really can't afford it. Now, we have decided that that's probably not sustainable, and in our view, which is a personal view, not desirable. And so we are seeking to change that. And that's basically what we're about, and that's why we're doing good. However, let's not kid ourselves. Not everybody thinks that what we're doing, not everybody would call that good. We are helping the relatively less advantaged. We are working, as Richard said, with the Department for Work and Pensions. They are giving out about 1/6 or 1/7 of the UK's GDP in benefits to 20 million claimants every 2 weeks or every month. For many people, that is by definition not a good. Helping those people is not deemed to be a good. So let's be clear, not everybody agrees that what we're doing is good. And I suspect some people in this room would not necessarily think that what we're doing is good. The second thing is, although there are people, starting with the Chief Government Scientific Officer, Sir Mark Walport, in his report of January 2015, and others in government who think that blockchain is an interesting technology to look into and investigate in the context of payments, there are plenty of people in government, and indeed in this audience, who don't necessarily think it's necessary. So what is the role of blockchain? Well, the only thing that I will say is I'm not going to engage in that discussion now, but I will say two things. One, we have put our money, personally as well as our investors' money, into the notion that the blockchain is a better way of doing this than, let us say, for example, single ledgers and open APIs. And two, the good news is that with the advent of changes in European regulation and legislation coming into force in January 2018, called the Open Banking Initiative, that actually we will get the opportunity to test the reality of that. Because banks will be obliged to create, in effect, open APIs to their standard structured databases. So we will have a real-life test case, a control case, because we have a real-life business. The other thing that I would say that I think is interesting in the context of distributed ledger technology is that IBM has now divided its consulting practice into two thematic groups. The first of those is artificial intelligence, and the second is distributed ledger technology. Now, I'm not betting against IBM. I'm not necessarily betting with them. They may or may not be right, but that's their bet. And the reason that they are betting on it is because actually there are now lots of examples, not just in the financial sector, but elsewhere, where distributed ledger technology is found to be interesting. So we have people like HSBC working in the area of trade finance around the world. We have food and goods provenance being effectively covered off by blockchain technology. We have supply chain management. Indeed, IBM itself is using a distributed ledger in order to manage its supply chain. We have programs related to the distribution of humanitarian aid. We have local energy markets in Brooklyn, Milton Keynes, and one or two other places, where people are actually using blockchain technology in anger to do interesting stuff. It may or may not be the way of the future, but we think it has interesting possibilities. But let's not kid ourselves that it's easy, right? So how do you engage people? Let me tell you, most people are engaging with us have no idea what technology we're using and could absolutely care less. They care about the functionality of the application and how that helps or does not help them live their lives better. And they have given us some very detailed feedback as to what they want that functionality to do, some of which is done more easily using a blockchain, and some of which is actually harder using a blockchain. But we have got very clear feedback that the user doesn't care. So you engage them not with the technology, you engage them with the problem that you're solving. And in their case, the problem that we are solving is they're in a cash environment which costs them as a family £1,300 a year on average. We are helping them reduce that bill. In terms of challenges of scale, all I would say is start small. We have been part of the first cohort of the FCA Sandbox initiative. I was actually at the FCA at their away day yesterday explaining what it was like for us to about 300 of their staff. Generally, we found it very positive, but the main reason we found it positive was it allowed us to play in the real world without doing too much harm to ourselves and managing to do no harm to anybody else. But we have learned a lot of lessons as we have applied blockchain technology in the real world, both small scale, medium scale. We are now in the process of figuring out how to turn it into large scale. You may have seen the reports today. Bitcoin is doing 330,000 transactions. It's worth however many billion it's worth today. So blockchains are operating at scale, but they're not operating at scale consistent with financial markets that are doing hundreds of thousands of transactions in a tenth of a second. So scale is and will remain an issue. The last challenge, I have to say, and this is where we come onto the for good agenda, is in terms of getting it paid for. So the problem that we face is quite simple. Are we a business that's doing good, that might make money? Or are we a business that's making money that might do good? And both of those propositions are investable, but by very different people with very different expectations in very different ways and against a very different narrative. We believe that actually it is possible using technology to lower costs, lower barriers to entry, lower some of those things that I talked about that make this global system so ubiquitous and helpful, partly by making them local, partly by simplifying them, but effectively also by using technology to reduce costs. We think that by doing that, we can make money and do good by getting more people financially included. Time will tell whether we're right. Our investors will either be pleased or unhappy. I will conclude that I've either spent a useful 2 or 3 years of my life or have completely wasted 1,000 days. Thank you very much.